Zero.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Barbara, and I'm your host tonight. First, I will have to talk to you about animal cruelty, boiling the frog. Boiling the frog is luckily only just a metaphor we often use to indicate our inaction against climate change. And boiling the frog is also the title of a series of debates and conferences organized by BOZAR with different partners. Tonight, we join forces with Oxfam. Art and artists help us to better understand our humanity. They develop projects that help us to understand the impact of climate change and its many consequences. Therefore, BOZAR joins up with artists, scientists, economists, thinkers, and also citizens to rethink our relationship with this planet. This event was originally planned in the autumn of last year. It was meant to resonate with the exhibition Gallery of the Future, but due to the virus, BOZAR had to cancel the exhibition. Fortunately, there is now another way we can still have this debate tonight. Since March 2020, we are all used to having conversations in virtual ways, so we hope that you will still be inspired by what you hear and what you see tonight. Welcome, everyone. Tonight we take an in-depth look at the famous European Green Deal. With this plan, Europe is aiming to become the first carbon-neutral continent in 2050. A new European climate law has to cement this political ambition into a legal obligation. And this means a lot of tension between the lofty green ambitions and the vested political interests. For instance, it was only after long negotiations in December that the EU Council agreed to a 50-50% emission reduction target for 2030. Also recently, last year, a new common agricultural policy was agreed upon, but for many, that policy is already shooting holes in the Green Deal, as it largely keeps subsidizing polluting agricultural policies. What we want to find out tonight is whether this Green Deal is fair. Is it or could it be fair? Is it or could it secure a socially just transition? Because behind the climate crisis, there are extreme inequalities. The richest 10% of the world population were responsible for more than half of the carbon emissions between 1990 and 2015. This, of course, is an injustice which is felt most cruelly by two groups of people who are the least responsible for the emissions and for the crisis. Firstly, the poor people in the poorest countries of this world, the most vulnerable countries of this world. They are already experiencing the destructive impacts of a world that is 1 degree hotter than it was. And the second group are the future generations who will inherit a depleted carbon budget, and they will also inherit a climate that is more dangerous. So only a Green Deal that tackles both emissions and inequality can help us build a fair, resilient, and more healthy society. We will talk tonight with different eminent guests, and they will help us find answers to our main question: if this transition, this very big transition, can be done in a more fair and equal way. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Jason Hickel. He's an economic anthropologist and an author. He also sat on the advisory panel of the Green New Deal for Europe. He has done research on ideas of post-growth. The Green Deal is often by the Commission dubbed as a new growth strategy. This is based on the premise that green growth is possible, the idea that it is possible to keep continuing having a growing economy without growing resource use and without environmental impacts. It sounds a bit like magic. Dr. Hickel will question whether green growth is actually an effective strategy and whether it will reduce global inequality. This interview, his keynote, you will now see, is pre-recorded, but at the end of our debate tonight, Mr. Hickel will join us for a Q&A. So I now give you Jason Hickel.
Okay, hello. My name is Dr. Jason Hickel, and I'll be talking today about the Green New Deal, or Green Deal, or Green Transition, or whatever you want to call it, and why we need to have a Green New Deal that is not about growth, but in fact without growth. Okay. So I want to start by just kind of framing the debate that's going on right now. The debate is basically, you know, we know that we need to make this rapid transition to renewable energy. The question is that going to be good for growth or bad for growth? Okay, so the right is basically saying we have to avoid it because it's going to be bad for growth, and progressives are saying no, it's okay, we can have both. We can have both, you know, a Green New Deal or a rapid transition to renewables and growth at the same time. In fact, the Green New Deal will be good for growth, and this is the way that the European Green Deal is being sold to us right now, as a strategy for growth in the EU. Okay. Now, what I want to argue today is that this is the wrong question to ask. Okay. The real question is, do we actually need more growth in the first place? And the answer to that, I'm going to argue, is no. In fact, more growth is deadly and makes our tasks much more difficult to achieve. Right. So we do need a Green New Deal. But we need to have a Green New Deal that is without growth. Growth should not be one of our objectives. Okay. Now, first, let me clarify what the stakes are in this issue right now. The first thing to say is that you know, we have this discourse of the Anthropocene, and the discourse of the Anthropocene is wrong. It makes it sound as though all human beings are equally responsible for the crises that we face, when in fact this is not true. Not everyone is equally responsible. So ultimately, what's at stake is a question of justice, as we'll see. So I'm showing a slide here about responsibility for climate breakdown and how it breaks up by nations. Now this basically represents nations' excess emissions. By excess, we mean emissions in excess of the planetary boundary of 350 parts per million, the safe emissions threshold. What this shows us is that of all the world's excess emissions, the emissions that are now causing our problems, the US is alone responsible for 40% of them, and the European Union is responsible for 29%. Okay, the global North nations altogether, the rich nations of the world, are together responsible for about 92% of all excess carbon emissions. Okay, these are the ones that are causing our problem. The global South, which has the vast majority of the world's population, is together responsible for only 8% of total excess emissions. Right. So the cause is clearly high-income nations is the major problem here. Yes, China has a lot of emissions right now, but in per capita terms, it's a lot less than that in rich nations, and they've been doing it for a lot shorter time, so it's contributed less to their general overall fair share of the safe planetary boundary. Now, despite the fact that rich nations are disproportionately causing this problem, poor nations are disproportionately suffering from it. So we know that more than 90% of the costs of climate breakdown are happening in the South, and 98 to 99% of the deaths caused by climate breakdown are happening in the South. Okay, so the cause and the consequences of climate change are very disproportionate here. Here I'm showing a map that shows you on the top the nations that are most responsible for causing climate breakdown. And on the bottom, we see another map showing the nations that are most vulnerable to being harmed by climate breakdown. And what we see is these two maps are almost exactly mirror images of each other. So the main causes of climate breakdown are in the rich nations of the global North, and the main sufferers of climate breakdown are in the poor countries of the global South. Okay, so I mean, clearly this is a question of global justice. And we should think about this as also a process of colonization. The problem is a process of colonization in the sense that we know that the rich nations of the global north have effectively colonized our common atmospheric space, with consequences for the global south that are very similar, in fact, to the consequences that the south suffered under actual colonization over the past 500 years. So if our analysis here is not attentive to the facts of colonization, I think that we're missing the point. Okay, so in 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published a special report on what it will take for the world to stay under 1.5 degrees. And in it, they showed this graph, which I find to be incredibly powerful. What it shows is on the left side, it shows our historical emissions rising really rapidly up until today. And on the right side, it shows how quickly we have to cut global emissions to stay under 1.5 degrees. And we all know the story. I mean, we have to cut global emissions by half in 10 years and get to zero before the middle of the century, right? It'd be difficult to overstate how dramatic this trajectory is. I mean, this effectively represents a significant transformation of our existing global economy in a very short period of time. Now, keep in mind that this target is a global average target, and we know that under the Paris agreements, high-income nations have a responsibility to cut emissions more quickly than lower-income nations because of their disproportionate contributions to climate breakdown in the first place. Okay, so how quickly? Well, scientists at the Stockholm Environment Institute calculate that to uphold this principle of fairness, high-income nations need to reach zero by 2030 at the latest. Okay, so 10 decades to reach zero emissions. That is the objective. Now the question then becomes, can we do this with green growth? This is basically what the Green Deal proclaims is possible. Now, what is green growth? Green growth is what we call a decoupling of GDP, our measure of economic activity, from resource use and emissions, right? So you would have, as this graph shows, you would have GDP rising, while resource emissions rise a little bit less. That's called relative decoupling. This always happens regardless of what you're doing. If resource use is actually falling, that's called absolute decoupling. And if resource use is falling by enough to get back down within planetary boundaries, that's called sufficient absolute decoupling, okay? So green growth is a matter of achieving sufficient absolute decoupling while GDP continues to rise. So the question becomes, is this possible? Is green growth possible? And it depends on what we're talking about. If we're talking about things like air pollution, then yes, we know it's possible to reduce air pollution while increasing GDP. If we're talking about things like resource use, the empirical record is clear that absolute decoupling is not possible. If we're talking about emissions, we know that it's possible to reduce emissions while increasing GDP, but we also know that it's not possible to reduce emissions fast enough to stay under 1.5 degrees while increasing GDP at the same time, okay? There is a consensus around this, even at the IPCC, right? So this brings us to why we need a Green New Deal without growth. There are a number of reasons. The first is that growth makes it harder for us to achieve a rapid transition to renewables. Now, why is that? It's because the more we grow the economy, the more energy we use, okay? And the more energy we use, the harder it is to cover that energy, to supply that energy with renewables in the short time we have left, okay? So, it basically makes our lives much more difficult. The more energy we use, the more we have to churn out more renewable energy just to cover it, right? Meanwhile, if we use less energy, then it's easier to cover our energy demand with renewables. So all existing scenarios in the IPCC show that in the absence of magical speculative technological breakthroughs that suck emissions out of the atmosphere, we have to have a reduction of energy use in high-income nations in order to stay under 1.5 degrees, okay? Now, the second reason is this, that even if that wasn't a problem, then continued economic growth requires more energy use, which also requires more materials. Now, this begins to present a problem because, we talk about clean energy, and yes, it's clean in and of itself. The sun, the sunshine and the wind are clean, but we have to have materials to capture those, that energy. So solar panels and wind turbines, these things don't come out of thin air, right? We have to dig that material out of the ground. And most of that material, those resources, come from the global south, okay? So the more energy we use in a kind of growth scenario, the more pressure we're going to put on the global south and communities in the global south in terms of extractivism, right? There's nothing clean about that, and it becomes extremely socially and ecologically destructive, right? So here again, the less energy we use, the less material extractivism is required. So you can make the transition more socially just and less ecologically damaging in terms of materials. The third issue here is that continued economic growth causes resource use to rise. And we have to remember that climate breakdown is not the only crisis we face, okay? We face a multi-fronts ecological crisis right now. So not just climate breakdown, but also deforestation, soil depletion, ocean dead zones from chemical runoff, from industrial production and industrial agriculture, fish stock collapse from overfishing and trawling, insect die-offs are becoming a big issue across Europe, with insect populations collapsing by as much as 75% in the past couple of decades. And then, of course, we know, biodiversity collapse more broadly around the world, with extremely high rates of species extinction, up to 1,000 times faster than the background rate prior to the Industrial Revolution, right? Now, these crises, which scientists recognize are at least as concerning as climate breakdown, are being caused by excess resource use, okay? Now, there's a close relationship between GDP growth and resource use, which is driving problems on this front. So we need to recognize that, again, climate change is not the only problem. The planetary boundary framework is clear that there are a number of different planetary boundaries we have to observe, and we're overshooting many of them, not just on atmospheric CO2 concentrations, okay? So one of the ways that scientists think about the problems of resource use is by looking at a metric we call global material footprints. And I'm showing a graph right now that gives you an indication of how quickly global resource use has been rising over the past couple of decades. The red line in this graph is what scientists say is the maximum sustainable level of resource use, 50 billion tons per year. And as you can see, we overshot that level in the late 1990s, and resource use has been accelerating since then. There were some claims that, oh, we're going to have green growth, we're going to have continued GDP and a reduction of resource use. That has not happened, despite a dramatic shift to services and knowledge and IT, okay? In fact, resource use has been accelerating, not declining. If we compare it to GDP, we see there's a very close relationship, and there has been over the past couple of decades. There's not been a dematerialization of our economy. In fact, there's been a rematerialization. Our economy is more materially intensive now than it has ever been in the past few decades, okay? So again, the more you pursue economic growth, the more you drive resource use up, the more you have these ecological impacts that are devastating to our planet, in addition to just climate breakdown, right? Now, crucially here again, overshoot of resource use limits is due almost entirely to excess resource consumption in rich countries. So this graph that I'm showing you now gives us an indication for how resource use breaks down by different country income groups. We see that low-income countries are consuming way below the sustainable boundary, right? About 2 or 3 tons per person, whereas the sustainable boundary is about 7 tons per person. In high-income nations, by contrast, we're consuming around 28 material tons of stuff per person, right? 4 times over the sustainable boundary. Literally, almost all of our excess resource use globally is happening because of excess resource use in rich nations. And again, the consequences hit the global south hardest, because a huge chunk of that excess resource use is actually appropriated from global south nations. So, the metals we have in our cars, the coltan in our cell phones, the clothes, the cotton that's in our clothes, all of this comes from global south nations, okay? So there's a huge amount of extraction from the south. So the ecological consequences of overconsumption in the global north get offshored to the global south. Okay, so in sum, here's where we're at. If we want our Green New Deal, our transition to 100% renewable energy, to be ecologically coherent, technologically feasible, and socially just, it needs to be a Green New Deal without growth. right? We actually need to scale down excess energy and resource use. And this is clear in the existing climate models that we have, including in the IPCC report. It's just not yet part of our political discourse, and it needs to be. Now, the good news is this: we don't actually need more GDP growth, right? And this might seem shocking to some people because we constantly hear this discourse from the media, from our politicians, that of course we need more GDP growth. It's essential to human progress and to social well-being, et cetera, et cetera. That's why everyone is trying to figure out how to make the Green New Deal perpetuate growth, right? But we don't need it. And the reason we don't need it is because we know for a fact that past a certain point, the relationship between GDP and human well-being completely breaks down, right? And this is true in all high-income nations, which have exceeded that point. So take, for example, the USA. The USA has a GDP per capita of $60,000 per year, per person per year. And yet Portugal, by comparison, has a GDP per capita of 66% less than that, 2/3 less than the USA's. And yet Portugal has higher life expectancy and better social outcomes virtually across the board than America does, than the US does, right? Or take Costa Rica. Costa Rica has 85% less GDP per capita than the USA, and they have better life expectancy and better well-being indicators, better social indicators across the board. How do they do it? They do it by sharing income more fairly and by investing in universal public goods that are what are necessary for people to live thriving lives. Okay, so why is this that there's no clear relationship between GDP and human welfare? It's because GDP was never intended to be a metric that measures human welfare. It has no intrinsic relationship to it. GDP was intended to measure the welfare of capitalist expansion, not the welfare of human beings. Okay, so we need to get it out of our minds, this idea that GDP is a proxy for human well-being. Now, the exciting thing is that new research shows that we can provide a good life for all people on the planet, even with a population of 10 billion people by the middle of the century, if it comes to that, with 40% less energy than we presently consume. So we know that and by the way, that's enough also to give everyone access to universal healthcare at a high quality standard, universal education, access to the internet, et cetera, et cetera. All the basics for a flourishing life, right? With less than we consume right now. So what do we do? How do we go about an alternative vision for a Green New Deal without growth? Well, first thing is to recognize what the principles of a real Green New Deal would look like. The first thing would be a legally binding obligation to reach zero emissions by 2030, okay? 2030, not 2050, which is an ecologically incoherent objective and socially unjust objective for high-income nations to pursue, right? And not net zero, because that leaves all sorts of wiggle room for the maybe we can lean on the hope of some kind of net negative emissions technology in the future that we don't have yet, et cetera, et cetera. No, we have to be clear, zero emissions by 2030. Number two, we have to cap fossil fuels and scale them down to zero by 2030. Stop talking about just reducing emissions. We need to scale down fossil fuel use, right? What that means is cutting fossil fuel use by 10% per year until it is zero in 2030. That's the objective we have to set. We have to transition to 100% renewable, regenerative agriculture by 2030 as well, recognizing that fossil fuels are not the only driver of our emissions crisis. A lot of it also comes from industrial agriculture. That has to be part of our transition. That's my third point, okay? My fourth point is that we have to abandon GDP growth as an economic objective, okay? Recognize that pursuing GDP does nothing intrinsically for human well-being, right? We don't need it. So let's have better objectives. Let's target the things that we actually want to achieve rather than targeting GDP growth and hoping that somehow magically helps us achieve our goals. So what do we want to achieve? We want to achieve better wages for people, better livelihoods for the poor. We want to achieve better education, better health outcomes, ecological stability. Let's target those things directly, build our politics around that directly, rather than using GDP as a proxy. It's a bad proxy. Number five, we have to have policy to actively scale down excess material production and consumption, right? Now, why focus on scaling down material production and consumption if our goal is is climate? Well, because material production and consumption requires an extraordinary amount of energy, right? To extract and produce and transport all the material stuff that we consume. So by doing less of that, then we can shrink our total energy demands and make it easier for us to accomplish a rapid transition to renewables in a matter of years, not decades. Okay, so once again, the less energy we use, the quicker we can accomplish the transition. So this is what we technically know in ecological economics as degrowth. Degrowth, to give you a definition, is a planned downscaling of resource and energy use designed to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a safe, just, and equitable way. Okay, that's the technical definition. So the question that we have to ask then is, how do we go about scaling down excess production and consumption? Well, there's all sorts of things we can consider. We can talk about legislating for extended warranties on products, so our gadgets and washing machines and etc. don't break down every few years. If our gadgets and washing machines and other things we consume last 4 times longer, then we will consume 1/4 as many, or 75% less of them, right? That's a huge material savings, huge energy savings without any loss to human well-being. We can introduce a right to repair, right? So that everyone can get their things easily repaired and fixed for cheaply by anybody without having to go to some proprietary, expensive corporate process, right? We can ban the practice of planned obsolescence, by which products are designed to break down in order to generate more turnover. All of us have experience with the frustrations of planned obsolescence. We can make that illegal. We can ban food waste. We know that a huge chunk of our energy use goes into producing food that gets binned by supermarkets because of their advertising schemes and so on. We can cut that. Speaking of which, cutting advertising itself is beneficial on lots of fronts, because we know that advertising expenditure is linked to excess resource use, and also linked to a decline in our sense of well-being. So by cutting advertising expenditures, we can cut excess resource use and improve people's happiness, right? And there's tons of data to show this is possible. We can also shift from private transportation to public transportation. We know that private cars are much more materially intensive than public transportation. So there too, we save both resources and energy. And we can ultimately have a conversation about scaling down ecologically destructive and socially unnecessary industries, right? So right now, the dominant assumption in economics is that all industries have to grow all the time, regardless of whether or not we actually need them. We can have a conversation about what industries have grown big enough already, what industries are good and should stay the same, and what industries we don't actually need and can scale down, right? If our democracy is going to mean anything, it's the ability to have a conversation like that. So we need to do it. But the question that comes up over and over again is, okay, we scale all that excess industrial activity down, but what about jobs? Jobs, 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 right? Well, there's an easy solution to this, and that is, as you liberate people from unnecessary labor, okay, you shorten the working week and share necessary labor more evenly across the population, so that the benefits of releasing people from unnecessary labor get shared as more leisure time across the population, right? We can also introduce a job guarantee to make sure that anyone who wants work can get work doing socially meaningful and necessary work in communities for a living wage, right? Everything from building solar panel installations to retrofitting houses to regenerating woodlands. These are the kinds of jobs that people want to have, and these are the kinds of jobs that we need, something the private sector is not going to provide for us right now, right? As we do this, we can also reduce inequality, and this becomes a key pillar of a post-growth Green New Deal scenario, okay? Recognizing that we don't have a total deficit of money, it's just that it's all captured at the top, with the richest 1% in the world capturing almost a quarter of all new income from the global economy, right? The richest 5% capture almost half, right? So we don't need more aggregate growth. We can achieve our social goals right now without any additional growth at all, simply by sharing what we already have more fairly, okay? And then finally, we need to be able to expand universal social goods. We know over and over again that people's access to universal healthcare, universal education, affordable housing, et cetera, are the keys to a healthy, happy, flourishing society. The data on this could not be clearer, okay? And the reason this contributes to a post-growth scenario is that it enables people to access the goods they need to live well without needing ever-rising private incomes in order to do so, right? Now, in conclusion, I just want to say briefly this, that all of this ultimately requires that we reject the ideology of growth, okay? So by ideology of growth, what I mean is this, is that ultimately what is growth? Growth is a process of capitalist expansion. It's a process of extracting surplus value from labor and from nature, commoditizing public goods and commons, and accumulating that surplus among elites, then to be reinvested for perpetual expansion. That's basically what growth is behind the scenes. This process, which tends to be quite often destructive to both ecology and to human communities, is then repackaged in the cuddly sounding language of growth. And who can disagree with growth, right? It sounds so natural, it sounds so good, but basically this language of growth is effectively a PR campaign that ends up being designed to sell us on something we might not otherwise agree with, right? So we need to cut through the ideology of growth and recognize what's really going on behind the scenes and what we actually need and what we don't need, right? So if capitalist growth is based on extraction, accumulation, and perpetual expansion, then what we need to do is shift away towards an alternative economy that is based on reciprocity, care, and balance with the living world. And this is what we can accomplish with a Green New Deal without growth. Thank you very much.
Okay, we will, of course, come back to this inspiring keynote in our conversation, but I would now like to, and Mr. Hickel, Dr. Hickel will join us later at the end of our debate to answer your questions. But I would now like to present to you our 6 panel members. Some of them are here at BOZAR and others are at home. A first member of our panel tonight is Marinel Sumuk Ubaldo. She's a 23-year-old climate activist from the Philippines. The Philippines, which faces on average 20 typhoons each year and ranks near the top among countries most at risk from global warming impacts. Marinel's life changed when she was 16. Super Typhoon Haiyan destroyed everything around her and killed 6,000 people. Almost overnight, she says she was forced to grow up, and now she brings the voice of the local people and marginalized people of the world. She demands change, and she refuses to let citizens and governments look away. We talked with her previously, and we taped conversations with her, and she will later join us for the Q&A. Our second speaker is Vanessa Nakate. She's a 23-year-old Ugandan climate activist. During a press conference with young climate activists at Davos, she, as the only black woman, was cut out from a group photo. And since then, she's not only fighting for climate change, but also against climate change, but she's also fighting for representation of African activists in the climate debate. Here we also talked to her previously, and she will join us later tonight. Then we will also speak to Laurence Toubiana, who is joining us virtually. Hello, good evening. She's the CEO of the European Climate Foundation, a network of hundreds of organizations who fight against the climate crisis and who hope to solve it from every possible angle. She is the chair of the board of the governors at the French Development Agency, and she's France's former climate change ambassador. She was one of the key architects of the Paris Agreement, and she now uses policy tools as a way to shape the sustainable future for Europe. In 2018, President Emmanuel Macron appointed her to France's High Council for Climate Action. We will also speak tonight with Adélaïde Charlier, who is a member of Youth for Climate Belgium. Adélaïde is one of the leaders of the school strikes for climate, and she also did an internship with the Green fraction in the EU Parliament. We will also speak with Saskia Brikmont, who was elected as an MEP in the European Parliament in 2019, and who is a member of the Belgian Green political party Ecolo. And our sixth guest is Lies Krijnest. She is the head of private sector engagement at Oxfam International. She is a former EU climate policy advisor in Oxfam's EU office. She followed EU climate policy since 2011, focusing on both climate and energy and climate finance commitments. And she now works on responsible business conduct, mostly on business and human rights and inequality issues. Good evening. We will talk about three main questions. And our first question will be presented to us by Vanessa.
This fight is really personal to me. This is really personal. I take this as a personal thing because when people are denying about this issue, about climate change, about how climate change is affecting lives, I am really offended. Like, how can you say that if I have lost my relatives because of climatic disaster? How can you say that if our family have struggled? How can you say that climate change is not real when we lived how many days without having food, water, clothes to wear because everything was washed out. Our house was washed out. We don't have any roof to sleep on. We don't have anything because we started from zero again. And how can you tell me that climate change is not real when after we have rebuilt our house, there could be another typhoon that would come, stronger one. You know, my place is a very beautiful place. It is facing the Pacific Ocean. Since I am a child, I go to the sea, I get shells, I get everything from the sea. It is a paradise. I am really truly blessed to have been born in that kind of community where we can just play outside. We can just climb the tree, go to the beach, swim in the sea. But then Super Typhoon Haiyan happened, and it showed me that being in the coastal community, our geographical location actually put us in more vulnerable situation because we are more prone to storm surges. We are more prone to a lot of to typhoons because we are in the front line of every typhoon because we're facing the Pacific Ocean. So though we have an intimate relationship with the environment, I feel like it wasn't. I if I feel like it's not safe anymore there.
I think that when it comes to the responsibility of the global north towards the global south, it all starts from the history that we all know. When you make an examination of the historical emissions and the industrialization, you realize that the European countries built most of their wealth, acquired most of their wealth from exploitation of the planet, exploitation of our environment, and also encroaching on people's lands and, you know, everything that was pertaining to our life. We are in the climate crisis because of all these historical events of carbon emissions, of industrialization. So I think that the global north has a responsibility towards the burden of climate justice or moving towards sustainability fully on the global south. is unjust and it affects very many people's lives, it will be hard for many countries in the global south to easily move towards sustainability on their own without hurting the people that are living in them. So the first responsibility of the global north is to stop the emissions of CO2 in the atmosphere. That's when we will know that they can lead climate action. So they have to stop all the emissions. They have to stop any activity. They have to close coal power plants. You cannot be a leader, as you say, if you keep opening up new coal power plants. You cannot say that you are a leader if in just this period of the pandemic we saw millions invested in the fossil fuel industry. So a lot is needed from the global north. A lot is needed from their decisions and from their actions. One is to stop the emissions, to cut down their emissions, and also to help and support the countries in the global south in moving towards sustainability.
Okay, so Vanessa thinks the EU has a responsibility towards the countries that are most harmed by climate change. How should the EU take up this responsibility, and do the Green Deal and the climate law address this sufficiently? That is our first question. I would like to address this question firstly to Laurence Toubiana, if that's okay. Hi.
So you want me to respond to the three mentioned?
Sorry?
Because I didn't hear you very well.
Okay,
So
I will speak a bit louder. I will repeat the question. The question is the EU taking up responsibility in regards to the countries that are most harmed, as Vanessa is pointing out? Is this happening? Are we doing this? Is the Green Deal doing this? Is Europe doing this? How should it do this at this point?
thank you. I think we cannot say yes because, of course, the Green Deal is a very important move from the inside of the European, policymakers. But again, in a way, I would say forced by societies to move forward because it would never have happened. And when we look at the 10 past years of a previous European Commission, we never had this clarity of we have to go to zero carbon emission by 2050. And it is not one climate policy, it's a whole policies and encompassing all policies, including elements of the social justice. So on that side, it's a very important move, absolutely. It has been, we should really remember that the Green Deal is a production of the pressure on politicians, in particular before the European elections. So it doesn't come by miracle, it's because society have asked for that. So that's very positive because, the energy in society is still there and will keep the governments and the Commission accountable for that. And I know that all the colleagues in the European Parliament know why they have made this proposal to the Commission and remember how the president of the Commission had been elected on that platform. Nevertheless, when you look at the European emission, again, the fact to go to net zero, the fact in particular not to rely on offset, credits you would buy to somebody else, but you do really the job at home to cut emission is really good and important. And still, we are not totally, of course, clear on the different steps to go there. And it's interesting to discuss, Jason, insights on what we should degrow and what we should grow at the part of the European economy. On the other side, when you look at the imported emissions, in a way, we have delocalized a lot of our emission outside in other countries. And we know are in a very critical juncture. We have all this COVID crisis affecting heavily the global south and in particular the more vulnerable countries. So they are affected by triple crisis, the COVID crisis, the economic crisis that is coming because, of course, of the trade pattern being cut by the health issue, and of course the contraction of European economies and of course developed countries' economies, and at the same time there is a climate crisis there, and so there is now a huge responsibility with, of course, a big indebtedness of many developing countries, in particular in more vulnerable countries, that I think Europe, to be consistent with the Green Deal, is not only for us as an island of green, but we have to take our responsibility outside. It's not, again, in a way, delocalizing our dirty emission outside and not supporting the transition to other countries. So that's why I think Vanessa was very right, as well as Marinelle. There is a responsibility to support the transition in the global south. It's a lot of instrument, it's a lot of financial mobilization, it's a lot of changing the trade patterns as well. So it's a lot to do, but we can't say the Green Deal is successful if we just keep that into the frontier, the narrow frontier of the European Union.
Okay, thank you. I would redirect the question to Saskia Brigmont. The same question: are we doing enough? Do we really realize this huge historical responsibility, and how could we deal with it?
Clearly not. Clearly we're not doing enough in order to achieve our own goals that are set in the Green Deal. The Green Deal, I agree with Laurence Toubiana, is an important step, but we know that the objectives set for 2050 and especially before, for 2030, are not high enough, according to scientists, to achieve the global warming target, which is keeping the temperature below 1.5 degrees at the best.
Exactly.
We're going further with our current objectives. And we know that member states don't follow the higher objectives that you mentioned, which are now set at least 55%. Yes. It's still under negotiation, and we're not there yet. The European Parliament, where I am, has set 60 to 65% as a target. 60% has been agreed upon, but we know that we won't get that in the negotiations. So we still have a long way to go in order to bring the social aspects and the climate environmental aspects of the Green Deal together. And we see, and Mr. Hickel has really shown, that this link is important because we, as Global North, as Europeans, are responsible for the main CO2 emissions. And we see also, and other economists, Piketty and others, have shown that the more inequalities, the more emissions per capita. The 2015 report of Oxfam also shows that the most emissions are emitted in the richest countries. So we bear a historic responsibility, but we see that the EU still lacks a consistency of its policies, because we have this Green Deal, which is supposed to give the main line, you know, the skeleton of European policies. But there are two huge policies, which are the agricultural policy and the commercial, the trade policy, which currently are not consistent. The agricultural policy is under negotiation between the Commission, Parliament and Member States, and it's not going in the Green Deal direction, although we know that it's one of the main emitting sectors, and that there's a lot of work to be done, working on pesticides, withdrawing fossil fuels, ending the industrial agricultural policy, and so on. And on the other hand, today the European Commission has released its communication on the trade policy for the coming years. And I'm sorry to say that it's really disappointing. We were expecting ambitions, we were expecting a new trade policy in line with the Green Deal. And although the Paris Agreement becomes an essential element of the trade agreements, the targets are not set, the objectives are not set. And so it remains, as Mr. Hickel said, main conception of how will we achieve competitiveness of our industry, of our SMEs, and how will we keep the GDP growth as a target. And this needs to change. This paradigm change, this mindset change doesn't happen in the current trade policy review.
So we still have red cheeks when we are confronted with people like Marinelle and Vanessa who are asking us to be responsible.
We're not giving the appropriate answers.
No, okay.
No.
What is Oxfam's reaction to this? How do you look at, from the NGO point of view, at this question from these countries who are most vulnerable?
Thank you. No, it's a really interesting discussion. I'd like to pick up on the point that also Biana mentioned around sort of our internal actions versus external actions.
Yes.
And I think particularly in the Green Deal, what we still see is some of the, if we look at the external impact of our own climate policy. So first we have a responsibility, but then how we tackle that responsibility in some ways is also still causing problems externally. We've seen with the biofuels, bioenergy transition that where Europe is promoting biomass as a key sustainable energy source, that we're seeing land rights of communities in developing countries being really hampered. We're seeing food price rises as a result, and there's no real kind of change of tack within the current Green Deal. So biomass is still there. There have been some improvements, but it's still a big source of concern for us. A second possible area of concern would be around carbon border adjustments.
Yes.
A way in which European industry wants to ensure that there's despite climate actions, which may be more costly, that there wouldn't be a loss of level playing field with other industries. But at the same time, we see that industry has had many kind of anti-leakage measures around it already. The ETS, yes, the emission trading system of the European Union. There have been free allowances for industry. So it's been sort of a getaway for industry for a long time. So there's definitely concern that the carbon measure adjustments could sort of come on top of this and be, again, a postponement of action rather than real industry going nosediving towards that zero carbon that we need to see. We need to see. And then, of course, what was mentioned before, the offsets and using land-based solutions for reducing or for covering our own emissions. At the moment, that's still an issue we can keep off. On the other hand, in the corporate sector, we see lots of net zero commitments and ensuring, I think the European Union has a role also to ensure that those corporate commitments have the maximum amount of direct emission reductions as part of the net zero commitment. So I think that's on the one hand. On the other hand, in terms of support for developing countries and ensuring that they can actually participate in that transition, to deal with the impact of climate change, but also participate in the transition. There's many solutions that have been on the table for many years in terms of growing additional or tapping into additional finance pockets. At the moment, all the money comes from the aid budgets, which is something we've been crying foul about for many years. There are many innovative finance resources, and the Green Deal gives opportunities. I've seen there's obviously proposals for the EU's own resources from the carbon measure adjustments, from the ETS. A portion of that should absolutely go for a just transition, not just inside the EU, but also externally. Yeah. So I think these two parts are crucial. There's many things to say as well, I think, about internal carbon inequality of the European Union, where I think the Green Deal is talking, in some ways, it talks about just transition mechanisms, it makes some noises in the right direction, because as we see from Oxfam's own research, the carbon inequality inside the EU is astonishingly high as well. I was very surprised to see some of those results too. So we face the same problems from a global scale within the EU too.
We often don't realize that. Very briefly, Adelaide, are you hopeful or very skeptical when we talk about this question, whether Europe will take up some kind of responsibility towards these countries that are suffering most?
Yeah, to be very quick, I think what I am hopeful about is seeing the movement of Fridays for Future, where we don't talk about boundaries. We are a whole international and global movement, where even still today we had a call talking with people from all around the world, not thinking of specific, policies. Of course, we focus on that on our national level, but we are really seeing the global image every time and listening to stories that are not heard enough. And so I'm hopeful to see really this switch of narrative that we are trying to create in our movement that will come out, I hope, very soon in our society.
Yeah, that's interesting that you're more aware by meeting people and talking to them. Thank you. We will now move to our second question. And this is a question by Marinelle as well.
So if we want to save our planet, then we cannot do what was done in the past or what has been happening. If our leaders are ready to stop emissions, if they are ready to stop and close coal power plants, I believe that economies will continue to thrive. And when you talk about green growth, to some extent, some of these technologies, they are things that I would say are in the pipeline. There are things that need research. There are things that need funding. These are things that are so global north. We need things that can be done now. For example, when you look at Project Drawdown, it lists 100 activities that can be done to reduce emissions. And one of those activities is education of girls and women. But where is this? No one talks about this. I believe that this is something that can be done now on a large scale to not only educate these girls, but to also empower them. Because these are tomorrow's campaigners, these are tomorrow's politicians, these are tomorrow's scientists, as the new shiny technological solution to help fight the climate crisis.
Yeah, there is actually a very great opportunity in the green economy, because even there are researchers that says that if we will go for renewable energy, it will make more job opportunities to other people. I mean, it will create more job opportunities. And there are other ways to do sustainable development, that doesn't harm the environment. Example is implementing the circular economy, and then making sure that we are not funding coal plants anymore, that we are focusing our finances to renewable energy, because that is the solution, the renewable energy. We should not just accept that this is our life already. Yes, we cannot bring back what has been lost. Yes, we cannot bring back the temperature that is risen already, but we can still do something. And if we can do it now, we can do abrupt decisions, and we can do a lot of things, just to make sure that we will not end up in a time when there is no other option anymore but just to adapt to the effects of climate change, because we still can do more. We can do something if our leaders are just willing to really address this crisis, because our leaders should be the one leading the fight. Our leaders and the authority should be the one leading this fight, because they have the authority, they have the power, and they have the resources to really change policies, to fund green economy, to fund green projects that would support jobs for people, but also trying to protect and preserve our environment.
Okay, we will, for the second question, just take one question, the main question, briefly, because time is running. picking up on what Dr. Hickel explained, is green growth what is central to the Green Deal? Is this really the right way? Is this the most efficient way to make sure that we have a very good climate plan, but also climate equality? So maybe Laurence Toubiana can answer this briefly, if you can.
A big question. And of course, there is a lot of positive thing and ambiguities on the green growth notion. And as Jason Hickel said before, we have to unpack what growth is about. If it's the same, the value extraction you mentioned on labor and natural resources, of course, we have to cut that. And we have to recognize much more the share of the value in a way owned and by labor is we see that now, of course, with all the disorganization of labor contract in many countries, that this is really and of course impoverishment of many and the inequalities, etc. So I don't develop, all this. What I see, which is interesting, is to ask ourselves, in a world where we really fighting inequality is really central for, for social relation, for building institutions, for trusting the politicians, for really having systems that are both democratic and inclusive. And we know that inequality is really undermining all this. Then we can consider the different element of what is finally the value of what we produce and maybe look at them differently. Marina said, of course, on energy now, the discussion is, it's not always simple because, of course, renewable energy as well, there is an element of extractive industry behind that. And so we have to see how this extraction of precious metals or rare earths are made. But at least we can say, without, in a way, being wrong, that we need to decrease this fossil fuel sector. This one has to really decrease and go really progressively to zero or almost zero, while other sectors that provide for this very precious resource we need, energy, is driven from other sources. And then look at all the elements we have to unpack the discussion. Now it's very easy from, mainstream economists or government to say, look, the ones who are calling for revisiting this notion of growth are condemning this population to non-progress and not getting their basic needs fulfilled. But it's a more rhetorical than real, because even now, where we keep the same system, these basic needs of people are not fulfilled most of the time, and it's not improving, at least in some region of the world. So I think it would be a fascinating discussion. It was, of course, not mainly the discussion of NGOs, economists, more heterodox economists, but we see now the limits of the classical view. And I do think that's probably the moment to unpack this notion of green growth and to say, what are the sectors, what are the value, what are the common goods we want to produce, we want to share, and what are the one we may, in a way, think that it is more of the past of the economies and the future. And that would be a fascinating discussion. Citizens can say, what are we really want to have and to get? What kind of health system, what kind of quality of life, what kind of type of transport? So this is very concrete discussion, and we should not be captured by this very ideological discussion. Are we pro or anti-growth? Is what do we want really, our system to produce and to share?
Thank you. Same question to MEP Brikmont.
I think what is interesting is that we see changes happening from the local level to the European one. At local level, at regional level in Brussels, my colleague Barbara Tracht, who is Minister of the Economic Transition, is now applying the donut economy theory to the Brussels economic model, which is interesting because it means what? Taking into account SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the limits of our planet, and how we actually degrowth our economy. That's the whole purpose, without especially thinking about degrowth and this concept, which is highly polemical, but still it's it's an ongoing trend, and I think it can lead by model and show that we can ensure better welfare, work on the ecological transition while also ensuring better social standards, well-being, and so on. So the change is happening, and this will help, I think, also change the rules and the legislative side at the EU level. What is also interesting, and of course we need coherence of policies, but the environmental agency, the European Environmental Agency, has recognized that it's impossible to decouple biodiversity loss, climate change, etc., from the economic growth and economic activities. So there is a recognition of the link between economic growth and the human impact. And that's crazy because they're showing the way at the World Economic Forum. The latest 2020 Global Risk report shows that the 5 main disruptors, risks at the global level, are linked to biodiversity loss, climate change, and the fact that we don't tackle properly climate change, infectious disease, biodiversity loss, climate action failure, extreme weather as the main risks. And that's at the most important reflection level of economists, which means I think that change is ongoing.
Okay.
What the EU can do now is, of course, again, we're disappointed about the current proposal that's on the table for the trade policy, but still, the EU is working on due diligence legislation in order to, for instance, reinforce the due diligence of enterprises, of European businesses, and all along the value chain, also in order to tackle social and environmental dimensions and the respect of those dimensions in our trading partner countries. There are also instruments that the EU should improve, which is aid for trades or the neighborhood and cooperation, international cooperation policy, in order to reinforce those approaches through the instruments we have. So I stay positive in the sense that we are working on this, but it should be part of this global strategy. And still, there's no change in mindset. I see it also during the negotiations with colleagues of some other groups, and mainly the conservatives. They are still focused on growth and the GDP. And
But you see...
These reports will help us convince us, I think, that this needs to be rethought.
Okay. Briefly, for Oxfam, the same question. What is your reaction actually to Mr. Hickel's central point? We don't need this green growth idea. We should not do that because, well, as he explained. What is your take on this from Oxfam's point of view?
Yeah, I thought it was extraordinary how he explained how we're addicted to this term. We cannot unthink being focused on growth, and sort of going back to your initial point around being frogs in a boiling pot, it really feels like it's something we're grabbing on and have difficulties questioning, despite being in a planetary emergency. We have 3 of the big climate system are at tipping points or beyond. So it's a very, very, very strong concept, and it feels like a deep sort of human thing that we need to grapple with. But we agree very much with what you were saying and what Laurence Dubiana was saying in terms of setting that as the objective and packing along other objectives with it is probably a recipe for failure, because if we don't tackle the real challenges up front, climate change, biodiversity and inequality, and put those as key indicators that we need to guide us, and then we we have enough money in the system. Very clearly, Jason said this as well. What is happening right now is an extraction from resource base through workers up to directors, CEOs and shareholders. We've seen even during the COVID crisis, we looked at the top companies in the world. 32 of the richest companies in the world have increased their profits by over 100 billion during the biggest economic crisis that the world has faced in recent times. while 400 million workers have lost their jobs, more than 400 million SMEs are at the risk of collapsing. So something is clearly totally wrong in the system, and a growth mantra does not change that. What we really need is a new set of indicators. We have good examples. I know about the Brussels one as well in Amsterdam. New Zealand has looked at a totally revamped budget, not setting GDP indicators, but looking at health, education, well-being, also racial and gender inequalities. And looking at those things as investments, at the moment they're looked at as costs.
Yes.
But I think it's very much as what Vanessa was saying as well. Yes. Women's and girls' education, these are investments for being able to live as humanity on this planet. It's not something that you sort of have to negotiate and minimize costs for the sake of growth. I mean, we are looking at things totally topsy-turvy.
Okay, thank you. We will move on to question number 3, and this will be presented by Marinelle and then Vanessa.
We don't have time to blame the older generation that they did not do something. We don't have time for that. We need to have a collaboration from all the generations for us to really solve this fight, because pointing fingers will not solve anything. Pointing fingers will not solve the crisis that we are in. We have to collaborate.
Being an activist in my country, it hasn't been a very soft road, I would say. It hasn't been a bed of roses. There are challenges in the beginning, especially being a girl activist. Because of society, school, norms, and cultures, girls are expected to behave a certain way, to portray what they call dignity and value. And going to the streets was against that. So it was a challenge for me when I was studying activism, because I was scared to go against what society had said. I was scared to go against what school had said. And of course, even going out there, there was so much negativity, so many words, very, very disturbing statements that any girl would receive. I received. So it has been a very, very tough journey towards demanding for action. It has been a very long journey, I should say. But what I can say is that I focused more on the goal, on what we the young people want to see, on what we the young people want to achieve, and not on what the people had to say. In many countries, I think especially in the global south, activism is not as easy as we see it in the global north. It is hard to go out there and do climate strikes every Friday. I mean, big strikes, to organize big marches. It is very hard, especially if you do not have a permit or if you do not have an organization that is helping you out. So I think the EU can play a part in helping these activists, protecting them, and also supporting them in organizing big strikes. But above all, doing what they are asking them to do, to take climate action and give us the justice that we are all looking for.
Okay, Adelaide, what are your thoughts when you hear this? As an activist yourself, what are your limitations? How do you deal with the fact that it's not easy?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have nothing to say compared to Mariana and Vanessa, who clearly don't face the same consequences as I do when I am an activist here in Belgium, in Europe. Like Vanessa was saying, it's quite, I think, the only thing I was scared of while skipping school is the views of my teachers. So I think I was, okay with that. But the only hard thing is, of course, still, not seeing a lot of, I mean, there has been reactions, but not enough. And also, as I was saying before, our movement doesn't see reaction on a national level or European level only, but on a global level. And that starts to be really hard, especially that we don't only talk about climate, but also about injustice. So it needs to be seen on a bigger picture, and we don't see the reaction from our leaders.
Yes.
And I think if we compare our movement and the impact that we want to have compared to the impact that lobbies have, for example, towards governments, that's still very hard for us to see that we clearly don't have our space and our place in general in democracy, that the youth are not heard enough in the decisions that are being taken. We don't have our seat at the table yet. So we are imposing ourselves, you know, we're taking a chair and we're putting it at the table. And so we're going to keep doing that. But most importantly, we now, even in our own movement, we're questioning, okay, but who's going to sit on that chair, you know? Is it really us, or should it be other people? Should it be actually Vanessa sitting on that chair? It's others. Right. And now we're really trying to rethink that even more. So yeah, being an activist is for sure not easy, but I think there needs to be a real questioning on the bigger question of democracy and how we involved our generation, which are in Europe going to face more these consequences of climate change, to the decisions that are being taken today that are going to impact us. You know, how are we going to be part of this? And I'm talking about climate, but there are many other decisions where the youth should be more involved, and we are also seeing it in the Corona period right now. The youth are really not facing an easy period, and they need to be able to have a space for them to express themselves. So it's really, again, larger than just climate and emissions, etc.
You did an internship at the Parliament. What did you learn from the tension between youth who wants to have a voice and answers immediately, who are, for very understandable reasons, impatient, and this big political machine that has to go through all these legislation debates? How did you, has your view on this changed? What did you learn on this?
Yeah, for sure. We're learning a lot when we enter these institutions. I think what what I want to take from it is that there is more power actually as a citizen. You have a lot of power that you do not see and that you seem to forget, or that we want to tell yourself that you're forgetting, but you have this power. Politicians, correct me if I'm wrong, are really looking actually at their citizens and where they're going towards. So we have to lead them actually, you know, we can be the leaders. So if we grab ourselves, like if we go together, we work together as citizens, politicians will have to follow. They will have. So I think that's what we have seen with youth movements in the past 2 years, really trying to take that lead in society and, you know, making sure that there is ambition, making sure that we're talking about climate. So my goal now is really to tell citizens to, again, take that power that they have, because if they're not taking it, they're actually giving it to someone else. So I want to tell citizens, we have this power, we have to work together to make sure that we are heard, that we take our seats, and again, that we share what world we want to live in, especially for a generation who are going to have to take these roles tomorrow. And I don't want to take the role of that tomorrow. So I'm going to make sure we change it before I get there.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I have the same kind of question for other people. For instance, for our MEP, within the Parliament, how do you deal with the fact that your own role is also limited? You have this big construction, the Commission, the competition between member states, the realpolitik. What is your take on this? How do you deal with this personally?
Well, there is some kind of frustration, of course, but there is also an impact of our work. And thanks to the activists, thanks to the NGOs, I consider myself as the voice of those good lobbyists in the European Parliament, and I need them also to be stronger, to know there is a global movement towards a real Green Deal and enforceable Green Deal. And so it gives me also legitimacy to work and to influence policy making. But of course, the Greens are just the 5th group in the European Parliament. We're not the strongest, but we also see the influence we had during the negotiations on the Green Deal and all the setting up of the EU Commission. At the very beginning, we were negotiating with the other groups a political program for the Commission, which was aborted, but still the Green Deal is there and the targets are there. Not enough, and we keep working to get better ones and a strong EU climate law. But the influence is there, and I'm sure that step by step, more and more politicians will follow, because they are accountable to the people, to the citizens, and not to the huge lobbies, which currently are still with millions of euros in Brussels lobbying the EU institutions, and that is also real. So we need a counter power, and the counter power is in the hands of the citizens.
Yeah. We have a Flemish politician who always says famously, I know what I should do to tackle climate change, but if I do it, I will not get re-elected. So he's pointing out that I don't have enough support with the citizens. Is this a feeling that's still there also at the Parliament, or is this changing? The fact that the politician needs to feel supported by the citizens who vote for him or her?
It's funny because sometimes they look at the polls very closely in order to adapt their policy during campaigns, and then sometimes they don't, because when you see the polls and also during the elections period, climate change is very high in the worries and expectations of EU citizens. And when you see the polls on the Mercosur agreement, for instance, in Germany, for instance, 75% of the citizens are sensitive and are against the Mercosur agreement for climate issues and for the future of indigenous people. They are aware of the consequences that such an agreement could have, and they don't want to be part of that. And if politicians were all looking at polls closely, they would act differently. But there's still dogmatism, I think, you know, a certain ideology and the difficulty to change the mindset of certain people. And also, yes, there are still strong lobbies also influencing Germany, to follow with that example. The car industry or the chemical industry in Europe has been strong in pushing in favor of the Mercosur agreement, for instance. So again, we need this counter power, which is in our hands. And of course, we can be stronger together to achieve our goals.
Thank you. Liz, would you like to react to that?
To chip in a little bit and from another angle. I totally agree that politicians are sometimes short-sighted in what they look at in terms of their voters' preferences, but also there's sometimes a lack of imagination to really make sure that the direction we need to go in, the zero carbon direction, to make it attractive and fair. And I think particularly in transport and mobility, there's, here in Brussels, I'm very involved in looking at mobility in Brussels. There's an understanding we need to go to decarbonized transport, and that means including taxation of cars, particularly the high emitting ones. But you have a lack of courage of really moving into full investment in public transport, in making sure that people understand that the poorest communities are the ones who are suffering most from air pollution, while they are the ones who not actually owning the cars. Figuring out policy measures to support them to transition onto either public transport or to change their cars if they have one into lower emitting ones. And so there's a very short-sightedness, I think, of politicians when they think about the climate problems and what they need to do, not taking into account societal concerns. And I think if they would do that, you would also generate, beyond the support that there already is, even more support. Okay. Because people could envisage what it would mean for them. Because at the moment, some of the climate policies, and we've seen that in France, of course, the yellow vest reaction, are considered not fair because, as I was referring earlier, carbon emissions, including in Europe, are for a large part done by the wealthiest, or the wealthiest are responsible. 10% of the wealthiest Europeans are responsible for 25% of emissions, which is the same as the bottom half. So there's a huge disparity there,
Yes.
including in the emission reductions. If you look at those, it's the bottom half who've carried most of the emission reductions, while the top 1% has actually increased their emission reduction. So to make sure that we put forward a just society that has those climate goals at heart, I think is another way of generating much bigger public support for some of these measures.
Yes, I would like to pick up on this with Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, I think in English. With Mrs. Toubiana, what according to you, are the biggest lessons from that French story regarding climate inequality?
Well, the Yellow Vest movement has never been a movement against climate policy. It was presented like this for political reasons. But in reality, it's a problem of people facing, in a way, a distribution of costs they felt it was totally unfair, which in a way, yes, you don't tax emission from airplanes, but you tax more and more emission of cars that, of course, are not at the top of the level of emissions. So, and I can tell, and that was very interesting, that out of the Gilets jaunes, a new organization was set up by members of the Gilets jaunes with other type of organization and movement and activists, which we call the Gilets citoyens, that finally give birth to the Citizen Convention on Climate. And this convention, which I chaired during now more than a year, has demonstrated that when you give a citizen the time to look at all the facts, the time to get the information they need, and even if they were not talking about everything in climate policy, when they was related to what they feel they could support in their daily lives, but with the condition of some policies, tax system, etc., they come with positioning that are really in line most of the time with what the science, for example, the Haut Conseil du Climat or other bodies, and are much, much more in advance than what the political leaders are ready to deliver. So that's really interesting, meaning is there is a storyline, a narrative saying from the political level, society is not ready. Whereas in reality, and that's what these young activists are saying, the society is ready, but you have to do your job to allow for the conditions, the access, for example, to clean transport. Of course, if you have an old car and you cannot change and you live at 50 kilometers from your job, well, you don't have a choice. You don't have the choice. And for example, it's really fascinating what has happened with this citizen assembly, which I think these processes should be much more distributed for every big political decisions that had to be taken. Because of that, the citizen proposed that an access to a very cheap leasing on electric vehicle be provided for poor households because they could not buy it, just too expensive for the moment. The maintenance on electric vehicle is not expensive, but of course you have to pay the upfront capital they can't. So they came with that suggestion to say, look, if we want to be climate and fair, just do that. And for the moment, it's not. We didn't have a really positive response for the government. So I think this mobilization of citizens, I'm very confident in a way. It's very difficult. And of course, hearing Vanessa and Marinelle, just so courageous. And I do think that EU could do a lot to support youth organization outside. On the youth, for the advisor of the Antonio Guterres, the UNSG, the youth advisors, with whom I discuss from time to time regularly, they have asked for, in particular, one of the young activists asked for a program that supports the youth and the activists and the students in the developing countries, in particular in Africa, as an Erasmus system where you could learn climate, you could act on climate, supported by this cooperation mechanism. And I do think we have to support people. And that's super important in condition. I imagine Vanessa difficulty when she has to go out in the street and really so brave to do it. So I see that I don't believe the government will lead really. They will be led by the societies. Look at what happened with the election of Biden in US. That different, of course, forces that of course has convergent to push for the election. But he was not a climate extremist. He was not a climate activist. He has been pushed by the society, the American society, to deliver a very strong message on climate. And it's not the expert only. It's not because he has a very good team and very good people. It's because now there is a demand for society, even in the low income levels, that household and communities that feel now that they have an interest. So I think EU would really gain enormously in legitimacy. I know the political context is always complicated and difficult, but we could just support organization and young people because it's so difficult for them to do it. When I see in Uganda, in Kenya, in many, many countries of Africa, fighting for litigation against the coal mines, winning sometime, we need to support them. I think that's a moral, and it's very good for the exchange in what Louise was saying, having a network of youth activists that talk together, that have a global view together. And I think that absolutely necessary, and that should be really a task for EU to do it.
Thank you. We will now close the debate, but we will go on with the questions from the public that are magically arriving here. I will go through them and see who could answer best. The first question is about the presentation of Mr. Hickel, who points to the limitations of the GDP. So the question is, could there be consensus on European and global level to go beyond GDP for defining our economic policies? There are several other models that have been proposed. We have touched upon this already, but maybe someone wants to answer more in depth on this question, or maybe Mr. Hickel himself.
Yes, I'm happy to do so.
Hi, hello, yes.
Oh, hi, sorry.
Hello.
Yeah, so no, I think absolutely we should be having a conversation about moving beyond GDP as a very first step, actually. This is not a difficult thing to do. We know, as someone mentioned already, we know that New Zealand has done this about a year ago. They announced that they would be removing GDP growth as an objective in their government's next budget. Scotland's very quickly followed suit, and so did Iceland. There is an organization known as the Wellbeing Economies Alliance, which has been trying to unite governments and cities and also nations, even municipalities and so on, to shift towards focusing on well-being and ecological stability rather than on GDP growth as core government objectives. It's a movement that's really gaining steam, and I think this is a sensible first step for the EU to take as part of a Green Deal. I think it's essential.
Okay, thank you. I will move on to the next question unless somebody really needs to add something. Is that okay? Next question. Yeah, it's related, but I will still ask it. How realistic is this plan for the Green Deal? So the plan, the fact that Jason Hickel proposes to turn away from the growth idea, how realistic is it in politics to take this out of the Green Deal? Maybe this is a question for you.
I think it's fully realistic, and also because of these examples of New Zealand, of Brussels, of Amsterdam, I think that did it also, and showing that we can rethink the model. We need to think out of the box, of the current box, and be able to be creative, as you said, and try to find other models. And this is typically decision that should be made with citizens through citizens panels that are also flourishing now at regional level and federal level in Belgium, working with citizens on societal issues, such as the model that we want to keep going with. And I think, as also Laurent Subiana mentioned, people are ready to think otherwise. And I think this is something sometimes difficult at political level, because thinking out of the box, it's not that easy.
Thing. Okay, thank you. A question for Vanessa. Could Vanessa explain to me what kind of education she would like for girls to receive? Is there a general lack of educational resources, or should the curriculum be fundamentally changed? What about professional opportunities for young women after they graduate?
Thank you very much. With education, I'm talking about the general levels of education, universal education for every girl child. Allow me to say that we do not have a specific solution to the climate crisis. There are a number of potential solutions that we need to put in place in order to address this challenge. And what we have seen so far now being talked about are moonshot technologies of solar or electric cars or maybe cycling. And some of these things, we cannot be able to see them in maybe countries like mine. For example, I don't know when I'll ever get to see maybe an electric car in my country. I don't know how fast that will come. I don't know when I'll ever be able to see cycling lanes in my country so that it's safe for me to maybe cycle to work or, cycle to school. So I don't know when everyone in my country will be able to access and, afford solar energy in their homes. But then we know that there are solutions that can work for us right now. And one of the solutions is educating girls. We do not hear about this in environmental circles. But then Project Drawdown lists it as one of the 100 solutions that we can undertake, that we can put in place to be able to address the climate crisis. And this doesn't just benefit the girl child, this benefits her family, this benefits her community, this benefits her country. You realize that most of the people who are affected by climate change, they do not have enough resources to build resilience in their communities. But these things come from going to school. Some of them are not able to access or to be put in decision-making rooms, because the people we see in decision-making rooms are people with maybe bachelor's degrees, are people with master's degrees, people who are fully educated. So you find that a girl, maybe from the global south, from my country, who is seeing the impacts of climate change right now, who faces a risk of being forced into marriage, who faces a challenge of dropping out of school because her family has lost everything to climate change, how will she have her voice listened to maybe in the European Parliament? How will she have her voice listened to in those rooms where leaders ought to listen to those who are being affected the most? So I think the society, governments, they need to embrace this as one of the solutions, because we need every solution, and we need to address the issues of climate change, to address the issues of gender equality. And again, we cannot have climate justice without gender equality. This is a social issue. And if we are to approach it, we shouldn't approach it with just moonshot technologies. We have to also approach it with social solutions, like educating girls. And according to Project Drawdown, if we undertake educating girls in developing countries, we could cut down emissions by 85.42 gigatons by 2050, and that's almost a decade's worth of China's emissions. So I think that we shouldn't look at one specific solution to the climate crisis. We need all the solutions. We need the leaders to stop investments in fossil fuels, because we cannot eco and we cannot drink oil. We also need them to educate girls, because this will also help the climate. So if we are to address the climate issues, then we have to tackle all solutions.
Our next question. At citizens level, what is the most effective way to pressure governments to deepen Green Deal commitments and not just doing greenwashing? Who would like to answer this very important question? What is the most effective way to pressure governments? We talked about finding citizen support, and you suggested that there is more citizen support than maybe politicians realize. But still, this citizen wants to know what is the most effective way. Do we know what that might be?
I think it's a very hard question. Oh, I think Laurence Toubiana wanted to.
No, you go.
Okay.
Well, everyone has a response. On my side, very briefly, I think so. We have to go from people that respond by the vote to the question in a way to support, which is in our democracy, the way that citizens are delegating their sovereignty to their leaders, to their institutions. In a way, I would say reclaim the sovereignty, reclaim the right to act. I think locally, of course, you see already the citizen opposing or proposing or generating innovative solutions, because I think being activist in the broad sense is a way that you give citizenship an intention, an agency that can then make pressure on government. I think, of course, you make pressure on government when there is free election, because you can make your voice heard. You can, of course, but I think this has to be coupled with something really very concrete on the social innovation you want to see. And this is a way you engage with government, and then you can participate to campaigns or elaborate the campaigns based on the things you are putting on as a change in the life you are bringing. And this gives, of course, a lot of echo, because again, alone we cannot do anything, but united and with many actors, we can push the system to change through many things: consumer behavior, campaigns, activism, social innovation. But we have to create this space of innovation in society.
Would you like to add something to that?
Yes, I think the election is not and shouldn't be the only democratic moment, and that citizens should be involved in policy making and in policy decisions all along the mandate, through panels that are also working on specific issues such as post-growth, or including other indicators, working on concrete actions that can be led, tackling biodiversity loss, empowering people and girls, for instance. That could be all issues that are debated and constructed with citizens, and that's what we need, a new model of governance, and that's applicable to all EU governments and beyond. I think we have another quality of decisions and of policies when people, when stakeholders are involved, and not only politicians, because we are not experts. We are not experts in all issues, so we're not good legislators if we don't take into account a set of advices and then have our own opinion, of course, to draw policies. I think we really need to, again, think out of the current box and be able to work with citizens and empower them. Citizens are also consumers, and I think the power is also real to change. I think there's one sector we haven't been talking about, it's the fast fashion sector. We all fast fashion victims, and we're all buying and throwing away our clothes as nothing because they're cheap here, but if you look at their real costs, social and environmental costs, they're huge and impacting southern countries and less developed countries, and mainly also women and girls and children in the labor field. And I think, again, involving citizens in those reflections and bringing them to this reality that I think a lot of people still don't see. After the clothes, what does it mean? What is after this cheap price of my T-shirt? would bring more awareness and pressure also on governments, on enterprises, on companies to change this producing and consuming model.
Yeah, so different ways of consuming, voting, taking to the streets, striking, I don't know.
Yeah, supporting movements and NGOs, you know,
Yes.
and I think really informing ourselves in different ways. Like we were talking about greenwashing, this is really, I think, the most dangerous weapon today, you know, because like you were telling me, their companies are very good at selling what's like putting a beautiful image of themselves, and then really understanding what's behind is really the hardest part for a citizen. Well, like what I'm trying to do as a citizen, and it's still very hard today in today's world to be sustainable, but if you want to try as much as possible, is really trying to understand what is behind your consumption, what is behind your clothes. Like you were saying, when you buy something, do you know where it comes from? Actually, the local and the shorter you bring like the distance of your consumption, the better you have of the understanding of what's behind, and maybe the bigger trust you can have in it. And that's the same thing with how we consume, you know, for food, etc. Like, do we really know what's in our plates? Like, this is what I'm trying to, at least around me and in Europe, try to tell people, like, we have to start making these distances shorter. We have to start creating this new trust with farmers around us and really change the way we at least consume for food and fashion and many, like, almost everything. So it's really about, like, again, informing ourselves as citizens and not only trusting a commercial that we're seeing every day on TV. You know, this is also crazy how commercials have so much space today, but a lot of citizens really none, you know. It's impossible for our message to be stronger than a commercial of Coca-Cola or others. And that's also, again, a real problem today. So really citizens have to go beyond these commercials and inform themselves.
Okay. Next question. This is a question for Jason Hickel. And he has apparently already answered it in writing, but we will just repeat it in words because then everybody can share. Do you believe the global South can raise their living standards to a level closer to ours without economic growth? Or do you agree that they should be allowed to pursue economic growth while the North commits to degrowth?
Yeah, so the answer to this is a little bit complex in some ways. What I want to try to get across is that GDP is always a bad proxy for human well-being and social progress, right? So I don't think any country should pursue GDP growth as an objective. So what we should be thinking about is what underlies it, right? Which is basically resources and energy. And we know that when it comes to resources and energy, the vast majority of global South countries are well within their fair share of planetary boundaries. Okay, they're not drivers of ecological breakdown, and in fact, many, if not most, will need to increase their use of resources and energy in order to meet human needs. Okay. The global North, by contrast, uses vastly in excess of what is required for human flourishing and is the major driver of ecological breakdown and needs to scale down resources and energy use. So this is what we refer to as a convergence scenario. I think we should be able to accept the basic justice principle that in the 21st century, there should be no gap in terms of resource and energy consumption between the global North and the global South, right? Everyone should have access to the resources and energy necessary for a flourishing life within planetary boundaries. But get this, in the vast majority of the IPCC scenarios, which governments are using to make plans about climate policy, they presuppose the continuation of a significant gap between the energy consumption of the rich in the global North and in the global South. To me, this is utterly untenable, and we should reject it. And the European Green Deal policy does not take any steps to fix this, right? And so I want to reiterate the facts. As long as I'm here with you, let me reiterate the fact that that the Green Deal is not adequate. It's not enough. The earlier question was about, you know, how can we push the EU to fulfill the Green Deal? I think that's the wrong question to ask. The question should be, how do we push them to go much farther? The Green Deal as it is technologically unfeasible. Okay, it relies on significant negative emissions technologies to get them out of jail. It's ecologically incoherent. It says nothing about reducing resource use, okay? And it's socially unjust because it throws the global south completely under the bus. To me, none of this is acceptable. This is right. This is the 21st century, and we know what needs to be done, and the Green Deal is not getting us there. So we have to be significantly more ambitious. And what's required of us as individuals is not a matter of like, let's consume less. Of course, we should do that. Stop flying as much, blah blah. But ultimately, this requires solidarity and collective social movements. Right. The only significant changes in history that have ever been accomplished when it comes to transforming the economy have been massive social movements, the anti-colonial struggle, the civil rights movements, right? If you live in, a racist country in Jim Crow era USA, it's not enough for you to go into your flat and try your best not to be racist, all right? You have to go outside and create solidarities with social movements and ultimately organize to overthrow a racist system. And that's what's required of us in today's scenario. Ultimately, what's required of us is a form of decolonization. And our existing climate plans perpetuate a colonial relationship that to me is unacceptable. And we should be uniting with movements in the South to reject that and call for something fundamentally more just.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for Marinelle. What do you believe to be the biggest gender inequalities of climate change?
I have, sorry, I have this experience when I was in a big conference in Europe when just because I am a girl, just because I am brown, I am from the developed countries, you know, this thing that people in the developed countries, people, activists or colored, are generally called the victims, you know. And sometimes, even if we say what we mean, even if we raise our voices, there is an automatic reaction to just cancel or just um, that our opinions doesn't matter that much just because we are girls. And that's very unfair, especially for girls and for people in the developing countries, because um, people, I mean, there are so many activists already in the ground who are doing their work on the grassroots communities, and they're not given the right platform to really showcase what they have been doing in the developing, I mean, in their communities. And most of these leaders in the communities are girls, but they are not given the right platform to really showcase what they have been doing and to really be part of the decision making processes or be part of the table where the decision is being made. Usually it is the boys, it is the men who are being sent to big conferences to talk about what we should do, what are the ways of forward, because they're men, and that is just unfair for women who are already doing so much in the grassroots. They're doing so much in the communities, and they have been doing a lot of adaptation and mitigation measures on their own, and they're not given the platform to be heard just because they're girls. Also, I have seen, like, this is my personal experience, that just because I am a girl, I am not given the priority to education. It is very true when Vanessa said earlier that education is one of the key that we should really do in order to solve the climate crisis. Because in the end, it is girls and women who are one of the most vulnerable sector when there are climate disasters. Like here in the Philippines, we always go to evacuation centers when there are disasters. Yet our evacuation center don't have any room for women who are breastfeeding or women who have these special needs. And there is no separate room for comfort rooms for women and men, which kind of increases rape or abuses, sexual harassments when there are disasters, because there is no right implementation in terms of how evacuees or how these people should be evacuated when there are disasters. So like, there we should aim for gender equity, because for me, when we reach that gender equity, we would be reaching equality.
Okay, thank you. Maybe a last question, depending on how long the answer will be, for Mr. Hickel. How do you think the elite can be convinced to share their money and material comfort and to decrease their level of consumption? Isn't this against their interest?
Yeah, it's a good question. What's interesting about ecological economics is that we spend a lot of time demonstrating empirically, scientifically, that it's possible to live in a flourishing society without growth. But this doesn't answer the political question, which is, rich people benefit prodigiously from growthism. How do you get them to voluntarily abandon it? And I can be very brief. The solution is that it will not happen in a top-down manner. It requires social movements. It requires social movements to, first of all, open up a conversation and change minds about what our society should be pursuing, what counts as progress. Then it also requires social movements to compel politicians to act. Of course, it's not unprecedented. We know that it's been done before, that social movements can compel politicians to act radically, and that's what's required now. But simply voting and hoping that it's going to happen, I think, is not adequate. It does require civil disobedience, collective organizing, and so on.
Yeah, so civil disobedience is one of the things you also mentioned that's interesting with regards to the other question on what can citizens do most efficiently. Thank you very much. I think I'm having just a look at the organizer, but I think we can leave it at that, and thanks to everyone for your interesting information, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Which camera to wave.
Bye.